Hey guys, tonight the journey leads onto ancient trade routes, into bustling caravanserais, across storm-tossed seas, and through customs houses of distant cities, following the travelling merchants who formed the nervous system of pre-modern economies. These men, and occasionally women, who transported goods across vast distances, navigated between cultures, risked everything on ventures that might bring fortune or ruin, lived lives that were simultaneously romantic adventures and grinding ordeals, cosmopolitan experiences and lonely exiles from home. Before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if there's genuine interest in what unfolds here, and let everyone know, in the comments where the viewing is happening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and ease into tonight's journey together. When modern minds imagine medieval or ancient merchants, certain images tend to surface. Caravans of camels crossing endless deserts, ships laden with exotic spices arriving in distant ports, cosmopolitan traders speaking multiple languages and moving effortlessly between cultures. These visions carry some truth, certainly, but they represent only the most romantic veneer of lives that were far more complex, dangerous, and often tedious than the adventure stories suggest. The travelling merchant occupied a peculiar position in pre-modern societies, economically essential, as these traders literally connected disparate regions and made possible the exchange of goods that no single area could produce entirely for itself. Merchants nonetheless often faced social suspicion and moral condemnation. Religious traditions from Christianity to Islam to Buddhism expressed ambivalence about merchants and profit-seeking. Aristocratic classes who dominated social hierarchies typically looked down on commercial activity as beneath their dignity. Yet everyone depended on the goods merchants brought, and successful merchants could accumulate wealth rivaling or exceeding that of nobles. Understanding the merchant's life requires first grasping the economic context. The pre-modern world was characterized by extreme geographic specialization in production. Silk came from China. Certain spices grew only in specific Indonesian islands. The finest wool originated in particular English regions. Gold came from West African mines. Every region produced some goods others desired while lacking products available elsewhere. This geographic distribution of resources and productive capabilities created the fundamental economic logic that made long-distance trade profitable, despite its difficulties and dangers. The profit margins had to be substantial to justify the risks and costs of long-distance trade. A merchant might invest everything in goods, transport them for months or years, and arrive to find markets glutted or political situations changed, losing his entire investment. The constant possibility of catastrophic loss meant that successful trades needed to return multiples of initial investment to compensate for the failures and provide actual profit. Markup of several 100% was common and sometimes necessary for long-distance luxury trades. This high-risk, high-reward structure attracted certain personality types and created distinctive merchant cultures. The successful travelling merchant needed courage to face dangers, calculation to assess opportunities, flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances, cultural sensitivity to navigate foreign societies, linguistic ability to communicate across language barriers, and either strong nerves or fatalistic acceptance of fortune's whims. Not everyone possessed this combination of traits, which is why merchants, despite being essential to economic function, remained a relatively small portion of most pre-modern populations. The geographic scope under consideration tonight is vast, encompassing primarily the medieval period from roughly 800 to 1500 CE, focusing on the interconnected trade routes linking Europe, the Islamic world, India, Central Asia, and China. This was the era of the Silk Road's medieval revival, of Muslim merchants dominating Indian Ocean trade, of Italian city-states controlling Mediterranean commerce, of trans-Saharan caravans connecting West Africa to the Mediterranean. The routes were long, the distances immense, and the cultural diversity merchants encountered was extraordinary. The sources for understanding merchant lives are richer for some times and places than others. Muslim travellers like Ibn Battuta and Jewish merchants whose correspondence survived in the Cairo Geniza provide detailed personal accounts. Italian merchant manuals and account books reveal business practices and concerns. Chinese sources describe merchants travelling westward. European sources, particularly from Venice, Florence, and other commercial centres, illuminate Mediterranean trade. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks, caravansary ruins, and other material remains complements written sources. Yet gaps remain, particularly for the experiences of less successful merchants, for regions less thoroughly documented, and for the women involved in trade whose activities were less likely to be recorded. The sources tend toward the wealthy, the successful, and the literate, potentially skewing our understanding toward the best-case scenarios, rather than the typical experiences of average traders. Tonight's exploration begins not at the journey's start, but in the preparation phase, examining how merchant ventures were financed and organised. From there, the path leads onto the road itself, exploring the daily realities of caravan and maritime travel. The journey continues through the dangers that haunted merchants' nightmares, the business of actually conducting trade in foreign lands, the social worlds merchants inhabited, and the cultural impacts of their activities. The goal is understanding not just the economic mechanics, but the lived human experience of being a travelling merchant. So settle in, perhaps with appreciation for overnight shipping and online ordering that bring distant goods without personal risk, and prepare to discover what it was actually like to spend months or years travelling hazardous routes carrying valuable goods through foreign lands. The reality involves more anxiety, more discomfort, more cultural confusion, and more courage than the romantic images suggest, while also containing the genuine adventure, profit potential, and cosmopolitan experiences that made some people willing to choose this demanding life. Long before a merchant set foot on the road, extensive preparations transformed abstract trade opportunities into concrete ventures. The process of organising a trading journey revealed the economic, social, and practical complexities that defined merchant life. Understanding these preliminaries shows that being a merchant involved as much careful calculation and relationship management as it did actual travelling. The first and most fundamental challenge was capital. Long-distance trade required substantial upfront investment to purchase goods for sale, outfit the journey, hire protection and transport, and provide living expenses during travel that might last months or years. Few individuals possess sufficient personal wealth to finance large ventures alone, creating the need for various partnership arrangements and financing mechanisms that allowed merchants to pool resources and share risks. One common arrangement was the commenda, known by various names in different regions but following similar logic throughout the medieval Mediterranean and Islamic worlds. In this partnership, one party, typically a wealthy individual who stayed home, provided capital while another party, the travelling merchant, provided labour and expertise by actually conducting the journey. Profits were divided according to predetermined ratios, often 2/3 to the investor and 1/3 to the travelling merchant. Though variations existed, the commenda distributed risks while aligning incentives. The investor risked losing capital if the venture failed but didn't risk his person, or face the journey's hardships. The travelling merchant risked his life and invested his time and expertise but didn't risk his own capital. Both parties had strong incentives to ensure success. The investor wanted return on capital, the traveller wanted his profit share and his reputation for future ventures. The arrangement allowed wealthy individuals to profit from trade without travelling while enabling skilled but less wealthy merchants to participate in ventures they couldn't finance alone. Multiple investors might pool capital for a single venture, distributing risk more broadly. A large trading expedition might be financed by dozens of investors, each contributing portions of the capital and receiving proportional profit shares. This risk distribution meant that a single catastrophic loss wouldn't ruin any individual investor, while successful ventures provided returns to many parties. The resulting investment portfolios, with merchants and investors participating in multiple ventures simultaneously, created diversified risk exposure. Some merchants did finance their own ventures, investing personal capital accumulated through previous successful trades or inherited wealth. These independent merchants potentially earned larger profits by not sharing with investors, but they also bore all risks personally. A single disaster could destroy an independent merchant financially, while a merchant operating with others' capital might lose his expected profit but not his own resources. The selection of trade goods required careful market analysis and calculation. Merchants needed to identify goods that were relatively inexpensive in the origin market and likely to command high prices in the destination market. The ideal trade good was lightweight relative to its value, durable enough to survive long journeys, had steady demand in the destination, and offered sufficient profit margin to justify the venture's risks and costs. Luxury goods dominated long-distance trade precisely because they met these criteria. Silk from China was light, valuable, durable, and desired throughout Eurasia. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves came from specific limited sources, but were valued across continents. Precious stones and pearls concentrated enormous value in tiny, easily transported packages. Fine textiles, whether Chinese silks, Indian cottons, or European woolens, offered favourable value-to-weight ratios. These luxury goods formed the backbone of long-distance trade. The quantities purchased represented significant calculations. Too little merchandise meant the venture couldn't generate sufficient profit to justify costs. Too much meant excessive capital tied up in goods that might not all sell, or required more extensive transport arrangements driving up costs. Merchants had to estimate destination demand, assess competition, and judge optimal quantities based on imperfect information and considerable uncertainty. The diversification of cargo spread risks. Carrying only one type of good meant that if that market collapsed, or the goods were damaged, the entire venture failed. Carrying multiple types of goods meant that problems with one commodity might be offset by success with others. Experienced merchants balanced the desire for diversification against the practical limits of what they could transport, and the need for sufficient quantities of each good to make wholesaling worthwhile. The procurement of goods involved negotiating with producers or wholesalers, assessing quality, and arranging for goods to be prepared for transport. Quality assessment was crucial, as paying for high-quality goods but receiving inferior merchandise would destroy profit margins. Merchants needed expertise in evaluating whatever goods they traded, judging silk quality, assessing spice purity, distinguishing genuine gems from imitations. This expertise was acquired through experience and sometimes jealously guarded as trade secrets. The outfitting of the journey itself required extensive preparation. Merchants needed to arrange transport, whether by ship for maritime trade, pack animals for overland routes, or combinations of multiple transport modes. The costs of this transport were substantial. Hiring a ship or ship space, purchasing or renting camels, horses, or mules, engaging cart drivers or caravan organisers, all these services required payment in advance. Personal equipment for the journey included clothing suitable for climates the merchant would traverse, sturdy footwear, weapons for protection, writing materials for maintaining accounts, and various tools and supplies needed during travel. The travelling merchant couldn't assume he could easily purchase items en route, so over-preparation was safer than under-preparation, even though it added to the burden being carried. Hiring suitable companions and assistants was another important consideration. Long journeys, particularly through dangerous areas, required travelling in groups for safety. Merchants needed to identify other traders travelling the same routes and arrange to journey together, forming caravans large enough to deter bandits, while not so large that coordination became impossible. Additionally, merchants with sufficient capital might hire guards, servants, assistants, and interpreters to accompany them. The vetting of companions and employees required care. Trust was essential when travelling with valuable goods through remote areas. A dishonest companion could steal merchandise, collude with bandits, or otherwise sabotage the venture. Merchants relied on reputation networks, personal references, and sometimes kinship or ethnic ties to identify trustworthy associates. The merchant communities in major trade centres served as clearinghouses for reputation information. Documentation was increasingly important as commercial law developed. Contracts specified partnership terms, cargo ownership, profit-sharing arrangements, and obligations of various parties. Bills of lading documented goods being shipped. Letters of credit allowed merchants to access funds in distant locations without physically carrying all their capital. Insurance contracts, which developed gradually, allowed merchants to transfer some risks to insurers for premium payments. This paperwork created legal records and obligations that helped structure ventures and resolve disputes. The timing of departure was strategic. Monsoon patterns determined sailing seasons in the Indian Ocean, with merchants needing to catch appropriate winds. weather and seasonal conditions affected overland routes, with some passes being impassable in winter, while summer heat made desert crossings deadly. Political conditions influenced timing as well, with wars, regime changes, and diplomatic disputes making some routes temporarily too dangerous. The farewell rituals before departure reflected the journey's gravity and uncertainty. Merchants visited family tombs to honour ancestors and seek their protection. They made offerings at religious sites, whether mosques, churches or temples, seeking divine blessing for the journey. They settled debts, arranged for family support during their absence, and sometimes made wills in case they didn't return. These preparations acknowledged the very real possibility that this might be the last time families saw each other. Families left behind faced their own challenges. A merchant's wife and children might not see him for months or years. During his absence, she managed household affairs, maintained social connections, and handled any business matters that arose. The successful merchant wife needed administrative capability, social skill, and strength to manage alone during extended spousal absences. Some merchant families travelled together, but this was rarer and posed its own risks and challenges. The emotional dimensions of preparation included anticipation, anxiety, and the psychological shift from settled domestic life to mobile commercial adventure. Merchants had to mentally prepare for the hardships ahead, the dangers they would face, and the cultural disorientation of moving between societies. Experienced merchants had been through this before and knew what to expect. First-time merchants faced unknowns that must have generated considerable fear alongside excitement. Some merchants kept detailed preparations journals, recording purchases made, contracts signed, arrangements completed, and prayers offered. These records served both as business documentation and as psychological tools, creating a sense of control and readiness. The discipline of systematic preparation helped manage the anxiety that sensible people felt when preparing for dangerous ventures into unknown territories. The preparation phase also involved intelligence gathering. Merchants sought information about conditions along routes, political situations in destinations, market conditions, and any other factors that might affect the venture. This information came from other merchants who had recently travelled those routes, from letters and reports circulating through merchant networks, and from any other available sources. Better information led to better decisions and improved chances of success. The social dimensions of preparation included negotiating status and partnerships within merchant communities. Merchants operated within networks of relationships that provided information, trust, partnerships, and support. Preparing for a journey involved activating these networks, calling in favours, establishing new relationships, and positioning oneself within the commercial social structure. Social capital was as important as financial capital for many merchants. By the time a merchant was actually ready to depart, weeks or months of preparation had transformed an abstract idea into a concrete venture, with goods purchased, partnerships formed, transport arranged, documentation prepared, and departure dates set. The preparation revealed the merchant's skill, connections, and judgment. Poor preparation often led to failure, even if the journey itself went smoothly, while thorough preparation couldn't guarantee success but substantially improved the odds. The merchant's life, even before the journey began, was one of calculation, relationship management, and calculated risk-taking that required intelligence, diligence, and courage even in the preparatory phase. Once preparations were complete and the departure date arrived, merchants entered a different mode of existence defined by movement, uncertainty, and the daily rhythms of travel. Understanding the actual experience of being on the road, whether overland by caravan or by sea on merchant vessels, reveals the physical hardships, practical challenges, and mental adaptations that made merchant life demanding regardless of eventual profit or loss. Overland travel by caravan was the dominant form of long-distance trade across much of Eurasia. Caravans ranged from a few merchants travelling together for mutual protection, to massive organised expeditions numbering hundreds of people, thousands of animals, and extensive goods. The size depended on the route, the goods being transported, the security situation, and the organisation capacity of caravan leaders. Larger caravans offered better protection but moved more slowly and required more coordination. The typical day in a caravan began before dawn. Merchants and caravan personnel rose in darkness to prepare for the day's travel. Animals had to be loaded with carefully balanced packs, camp had to be struck, and breakfast had to be consumed quickly. The goal was to begin travelling soon after first light, taking advantage of cooler morning hours before midday heat became oppressive in hot climates. The pace of travel was determined by the slowest animals and the need to preserve animal strength. Pack camels walked at roughly 2 to 3 miles per hour, covering perhaps 20 miles in a day of hard travel. Pack horses and mules moved somewhat faster, but required more water and food than camels. Ox-drawn carts used in some regions were even slower. The merchants' daily progress was frustratingly slow by modern standards, with journeys measuring in weeks and months rather than hours or days. The physical experience of this travel was uncomfortable and exhausting. For merchants who could afford riding animals, the constant jolting of riding for hours caused saddle sores, back pain, and general physical misery. Many merchants walked alongside animals to spare their bodies, but walking 20 miles daily while managing pack animals was its own form of exhaustion. The physical toll accumulated over days and weeks, with merchants developing various aches, pains, and injuries that had to be endured without adequate medical care. The midday halt provided essential rest during the hottest hours. Caravans stopped in whatever shade was available, whether trees, rock formations, or shelters, erected specifically for this purpose. Animals were watered and fed if supplies permitted. Merchants rested, ate a meal, maintained equipment, and conducted any necessary business. The halt might last several hours before afternoon travel resumed, continuing until twilight made further progress dangerous. The evening arrival at camp, whether an organised caravanserai, a traditional camping location, or simply a defensible spot chosen for the night, meant more work before rest. Animals had to be unloaded, secured, fed and watered. Goods had to be protected from weather and theft. Tents had to be erected. Food had to be prepared. Guards had to be posted. Only after these tasks were complete could merchants actually rest. The sleeping arrangements were basic. Wealthy merchants might have tents providing some privacy and weather protection. Poor merchants slept under the stars or in whatever communal shelter was available. The ground was hard, the weather often uncomfortable, and the constant awareness of being in dangerous territory with valuable goods made truly restful sleep difficult. Alert merchants slept lightly, ready to respond to alarms or attacks. The food during travel was monotonous and often inadequate. Merchants carried preserved foods that could withstand the journey: dried meat, hardtack bread, dried fruits, nuts, and grains for cooking porridge. Fresh food was consumed quickly after purchase at markets along the route before it spoiled. The diet was nutritionally deficient by modern standards, heavy on starches and preserved items, light on fresh vegetables and varied nutrients. Vitamin deficiencies and related health problems were common on long journeys. Water management was crucial, particularly on desert routes. Caravans had to know where reliable water sources existed and plan routes accordingly. Carrying sufficient water for people and animals between sources required extensive storage capacity. The water itself was often brackish or contaminated, causing digestive problems, but being consumed anyway because the alternative was death from dehydration. Waterborne diseases were significant health hazards. The weather posed constant challenges varying by region and season. Desert travel meant extreme temperature swings from freezing nights to blazingly hot days, intense sun exposure causing burns and heat stroke, and occasional sandstorms that could disorient caravans and damage goods. Mountain travel meant altitude sickness, treacherous trails, and sudden storms. Coastal routes faced humid heat, monsoons, and the constant dampness that rotted goods and promoted disease. The animals that transported goods required constant care and attention. Camels needed regular watering, though they could go longer without water than horses. Horses and mules needed daily water and substantial feed. The animals got sick, went lame, and died, requiring replacement at significant cost. Managing pack animals was skilled work, and merchants either needed that skill themselves or had to hire and trust animal handlers who possessed it. The maintenance of goods during travel was a constant concern. Textiles needed protection from moisture and insects. Spices had to be kept dry. Delicate items needed careful packing and regular inspection. Merchants checked their cargo regularly, looking for damage, shifting that might indicate theft or deterioration that reduced value. Repackaging and repairs were ongoing tasks during rest periods. The social dynamics within caravans created complex interpersonal environments. Merchants from different regions, speaking different languages, practicing different religions, all travelled together for mutual protection while simultaneously competing for the same markets. Friendships formed through shared hardship, but distrust and conflict also arose. Caravan leaders needed to manage these tensions while maintaining group cohesion necessary for security. The linguistic diversity of caravans was extraordinary. A single Silk Road caravan might include Chinese, Persian, Arab, Turkish, Indian, and Central Asian merchants. Communication required multiple languages, interpreters, and often creative use of gestures and trade pidgins. Misunderstandings were common and sometimes led to conflicts. Merchants who spoke multiple languages had significant advantages in navigating these multilingual environments. The cultural practices surrounding food, prayer, and daily routine reflected this diversity. Muslim merchants needed to perform daily prayers at specified times. Christian merchants had their own devotions. The timing of meals, the types of food permitted, the customs around hospitality and eating, all varied by cultural background. Caravans needed to accommodate this diversity while maintaining coherent daily schedules. The entertainment during rest periods helped pass time and maintain morale. Merchants told stories, sang songs, played games, and shared information about their homes and experiences. These social activities served both recreational and practical purposes, allowing merchants to exchange market intelligence, share route knowledge, and build relationships that might lead to future partnerships. The stories circulating in caravans carried information across vast distances before any formal communication systems existed. The navigation of routes required knowledge that was specialised and sometimes closely guarded. Experienced merchants and guides knew locations of water sources, positions of mountain passes, layouts of desert routes marked only by subtle terrain features. This knowledge was valuable and was transmitted through experience and sometimes through written guides called rutters that described routes in detail. Getting lost could be fatal, making reliable navigation essential. Maritime travel by merchant vessel created different but equally challenging conditions. Ships ranged from small coastal traders to large ocean-going vessels capable of extended voyages. The maritime merchant's experience depended heavily on ship size, route, and season, but certain patterns characterized seaborne trade across regions. The departure from port required favourable conditions. Ships typically sailed with the morning tide, taking advantage of predictable tidal movements to navigate out of harbours. The monsoon patterns in the Indian Ocean dictated sailing seasons, with merchants needing to catch the right winds for their intended destinations. Mediterranean sailing occurred primarily in summer, when weather was more predictable and seas calmer. Life aboard ship was cramped and uncomfortable. Merchant vessels were designed to maximise cargo capacity, leaving minimal space for human passengers. Merchants shared crowded below-deck spaces that were dark, poorly ventilated, and often wet. The constant ship motion caused seasickness, particularly in rough weather. The inability to escape the confines of the ship created psychological stress that accumulated over weeks or months at sea. The food aboard ship was even worse than on land routes. Ships carried preserved foods, water that quickly became stagnant, and wine that was safer to drink than spoiled water. Fresh food was consumed early in voyages before it rotted. Ships that made port stops could reprovision, but long ocean crossings meant enduring inadequate diet for extended periods. Scurvy from vitamin C deficiency was a serious risk on long voyages. The sanitation on ships was primitive to non-existent. Waste disposal meant using the ship's head, essentially an opening over the water at the bow. Privacy was minimal. The smell was terrible, combining human waste, bilge water, spoiled food, and the general funk of too many bodies in too small a space without adequate washing. The conditions promoted disease, with dysentery and other illnesses spreading rapidly through crowded ships. The storms at sea posed existential threats. Merchant vessels were sturdy but not designed for extreme weather. Storms could damage or sink ships, destroying cargo and drowning passengers. The experience of riding out a storm at sea with waves crashing over the deck, the ship's structure groaning, and constant risk of capsizing was terrifying. Merchants at sea had no control over their fate, depending entirely on the ship's crew, the vessel's seaworthiness, and divine favour. The navigation at sea relied on accumulated knowledge and careful observation. Before magnetic compasses became widespread, navigators used sun and star positions, knowledge of currents and wind patterns, observations of sea colour and marine life, and experience with particular routes. Skilled navigators could dead-reckon their positions remarkably accurately, but the possibility of error was always present, with potentially fatal consequences if ships missed destinations and ran out of supplies. The social life aboard ship involved merchant passengers forming their own community separate from the ship's crew. Merchants shared information, played games, told stories, and passed time as best they could in cramped conditions. Some ships had designated spaces where merchants could socialise and conduct business. The ship became temporary mobile community with its own social structure and dynamics. The arrival in port brought relief from the journey, but immediate immersion into the complex work of conducting business in foreign locations. The transition from travel to commerce required different skills and presented new challenges. But the journey itself, whether overland or by sea, was the foundation of the merchant's experience, the ordeal that had to be endured before any profit could be realised. The physical hardships, the psychological stress, the social navigation, and the constant awareness of danger defined the travelling merchant's daily existence more than any romantic visions of adventure or exotic locales. Travelling merchants moved through a world where danger was constant companion rather than occasional intrusion. The risks ranged from human predators to natural disasters, from disease to political violence, from simple accidents to catastrophic losses. Understanding these dangers reveals why merchant life required courage alongside commercial acumen, and why the potential profits had to be substantial to justify the risks undertaken. Bandits and pirates represented perhaps the most consistent human threat. Every major trade route had its bandit problems, with desperate or opportunistic men preying on merchant caravans carrying valuable goods. The bandits range from small gangs attacking isolated travellers to organised criminal enterprises controlling entire regions and demanding protection payments. The threat was so universal that merchants had to factor banditry into every journey calculation. The tactics bandits used varied by context. In mountainous regions, they ambushed caravans at narrow passes where manoeuvre was difficult. In deserts, they struck at night or from concealment behind dunes and rocks. Along roads, they posed as legitimate travellers before revealing weapons and demanding surrender of goods. The sophistication of bandit operations in some areas rivaled military forces, with scouts identifying targets, coordinated attacks, and organised distribution of stolen goods. The defences against bandits included several strategies. Travelling in large groups provided security through numbers, with caravans of sufficient size deterring attacks against them. Hiring armed guards added professional fighting capability to caravans, making attacks costlier for bandits. Taking official protection, where available, meant travelling under escort by state military forces or utilising safe passage agreements. Paying protection money to local strongmen or bandit chiefs provided insurance against attacks by those particular groups. Despite these precautions, attacks occurred regularly. Merchants who survived bandit attacks might lose everything, arriving at destinations without goods and facing ruin. Some merchants carried decoy goods, hiding their most valuable items in false bottoms or among less valuable merchandise. Others distributed valuable items among multiple pack animals or different travelling companions, ensuring that a single attack wouldn't destroy the entire investment. Pirates posed similar threats in maritime contexts. Piracy flourished in areas where state control was weak, and where geographic features created opportunities for ambush. The Straits of Malacca, the Barbary Coast, the Persian Gulf, and numerous other maritime choke points had chronic piracy problems. Pirates might seize entire ships and cargoes, hold merchants for ransom, or simply kill everyone and take everything. The defences against piracy included sailing in convoys protected by warships, arming merchant vessels with crews capable of fighting, avoiding known pirate waters, and sometimes paying tribute to pirate communities for safe passage. Despite these measures, piracy remained a significant risk for maritime merchants. A single encounter with successful pirates could destroy a merchant's fortune and life. Political instability and warfare created dangers beyond simple bandits and pirates. Wars disrupted trade routes, closed borders, and created chaotic conditions where merchants became targets. Conquering armies seized merchant goods as spoils of war. Besieged cities trapped merchants within walls, sometimes for months or years. The collapse of political order in regions could make previously safe routes impassable until stability returned. The ethnic and religious violence that periodically erupted in different regions endangered merchants of particular backgrounds. A Muslim merchant in Christian Europe during a crusade, a Christian merchant in Muslim lands during jihad, or a Jewish merchant anywhere during pogroms faced violence based on identity rather than possession of valuable goods. Merchants needed acute awareness of religious and ethnic tensions, an ability to navigate or avoid areas where they might be targeted. Corrupt officials and arbitrary taxation represented more subtle but equally damaging threats. Customs officials might demand excessive duties, confiscate goods under false pretexts, or require bribes for passage. Local rulers might suddenly impose new taxes or seize merchant property. The lack of consistent rule of law in many regions meant merchants operated at the mercy of whoever held local power, with no reliable recourse against exploitation. The natural hazards varied dramatically by route and season. Desert travel risked death from thirst when water sources failed or were missed due to navigation errors. Sandstorms could disorient caravans, scatter animals, and suffocate travellers. Extreme heat caused heat stroke, while cold desert nights could cause hypothermia in travellers with inadequate protection. Flash floods could drown merchants camped in dry wadis. Mountain travel posed dangers from avalanches, rock slides, falls from narrow trails, and altitude sickness. Snow-covered passes became impassable in winter, trapping merchants who mistimed their crossing attempts. The thin air at high altitudes made breathing difficult and caused disorientation and poor judgment. Pack animals struggled at altitude, sometimes collapsing or plunging off precipices, taking valuable cargo with them. Maritime hazards included storms that could sink ships, rocks and shoals that could wreck vessels, adverse winds that stranded ships at sea until food and water ran out, and currents that carried ships off course. The seasonal typhoons in Asian waters, the sudden squalls in the Mediterranean, and the unpredictable weather patterns throughout the world's oceans made sea travel inherently dangerous, despite centuries of accumulated navigational knowledge. Disease was perhaps the most insidious danger, killing more merchants than bandits and storms combined. The crowded conditions of caravans and ships promoted disease transmission. The poor sanitation, inadequate diet, contaminated water, and exposure to pathogens in foreign environments, where merchants lacked immunity, all contributed to devastating disease loads. Dysentery, malaria, typhus, plague, and countless other diseases struck down merchants regularly. The medical care available was limited and often ineffective. Physicians, where they existed, relied on theories and treatments that frequently did more harm than good. Most merchants had to rely on folk remedies, prayers, and their body's natural healing capabilities when illness struck. A serious illness while travelling often proved fatal, with merchants dying far from home and being buried in foreign soil by strangers. The psychological toll of constant danger created its own form of suffering. Living with persistent awareness that death or disaster might strike at any moment was mentally exhausting. The anxiety before each journey, the hypervigilance during travel, the relief at safe arrival, and then the building anxiety as the next journey approached created cycles of stress that aged merchants prematurely and contributed to various physical and mental health problems. The accidents that occurred during normal travel killed or injured merchants regularly. Pack animals kicked handlers, causing serious injuries. Merchants fell from riding animals or precipices. Heavy cargo crushed workers. Fires destroyed goods and killed those caught in conflagrations. Simple infections from minor wounds became fatal without antibiotics. The absence of modern safety equipment and medical care meant that risks modern people consider minor were potentially deadly in medieval contexts. The capture and enslavement represented a fate many merchants considered worse than death. Bandits or rival states sometimes took merchants captive for ransom. If ransom wasn't paid, captives might be sold into slavery, disappearing into servitude far from home with no realistic prospect of rescue. The threat of slavery was particularly acute in areas where slave raiding was common, with merchants from certain backgrounds being especially targeted. The economic disasters that didn't involve physical danger could still destroy merchants. Arriving at a destination to find the market glutted meant goods couldn't be sold at profitable prices. Political changes might ban certain trade goods or impose confiscatory taxes. Wars or diplomatic disputes might prevent merchants from departing with new goods or collecting on debts. business partnerships might collapse due to fraud or incompetence. These financial ruins, while not physically dangerous, ended careers and sometimes led to debt bondage or suicide. The accumulated statistics, to the extent they can be reconstructed, suggest that merchant life was extraordinarily dangerous by modern standards. Estimates vary widely, but it appears that perhaps 10 to 20% of merchants died during their travelling careers from disease, violence, or accidents. Many more suffered serious injuries, financial ruin, or other catastrophic setbacks. The mortality rates meant that every merchant personally knew others who had died on the road, making the risks concrete and personal rather than abstract. Despite these dangers, merchants continued travelling because the potential rewards justified the risks for those willing to take them. The successful merchant who survived multiple journeys could accumulate substantial wealth. The alternative occupations available to most people who became merchants weren't necessarily safer or more appealing, and for some, there was genuine attraction to the adventure and freedom of merchant life despite its dangers. The risks were real, understood, and accepted as part of the merchant's bargain with fortune. Understanding the comprehensive nature of the dangers reveals that merchant life required not just business acumen but genuine courage. Setting out on long-distance trade routes knowing the statistics, aware of what had happened to other merchants, required either unusual bravery or desperate need. The merchants who survived and prospered weren't just lucky, but possessed a combination of skill, judgment, courage, and perhaps divine favour that allowed them to navigate deadly environments repeatedly and return to attempt the journey again. The transition from dangerous journey to profitable commerce occurred when merchants finally arrived at their destinations. But arrival didn't mean the difficult part was over. It simply meant transitioning from one set of challenges to another. Conducting business in foreign lands required different skills than surviving travel, though both were essential to merchant success. Understanding how trade actually occurred reveals the cultural, linguistic, and practical complexities merchants navigated. The first encounter with a new city or trading centre often occurred at gates or port facilities where officials controlled entry. Customs inspection was nearly universal, with officials assessing duties on goods brought into the jurisdiction. This initial customs experience set the tone for the merchant's entire visit and could determine profitability. Favourable assessment meant moderate duties. Hostile or corrupt assessment might impose crippling taxes or arbitrary confiscation. Merchants presented documentation when available, including letters from rulers granting trade privileges, bills of lading describing cargo, and sometimes letters of recommendation from known local merchants vouching for the newcomer. These documents provided framework for negotiating customs treatment. Merchants without proper documentation or connections were vulnerable to exploitation by officials who understood that foreign merchants had limited recourse against arbitrary demands. The search for lodging was the next priority. Major trading centres had infrastructure specifically for foreign merchants. The caravanserais of the Islamic world, the fondacci of Mediterranean cities, and similar institutions in Asia provided secure accommodation, storage for goods, and space for conducting business. These facilities were sometimes provided free by rulers seeking to attract commerce, while others charged fees. The better establishments offered armed security, basic amenities, and access to merchant networks. The typical caravanserai consisted of a fortified building with a large central courtyard. Animals were stabled on the ground floor, while human accommodation was on upper floors accessible by staircases. Rooms provided basic shelter but little privacy or comfort, being essentially spaces to sleep with limited furniture or amenities. The central courtyard served as trading floor, social gathering space, and animal exercise area. The entire complex could be secured at night, protecting merchants and goods from theft. The settling into lodging involved securing merchandise, paying whatever fees were required, establishing security arrangements, and beginning the process of acclimating to the local environment. Merchants had to rapidly learn local geography, identify appropriate markets, locate necessary services, and establish contact with the merchant community. First-time visitors to a city operated at severe disadvantage compared to experienced traders familiar with local conditions. The assessment of market conditions was crucial before beginning trade. Merchants needed to understand current prices, gauge demand for their goods, identify potential buyers, and assess competition from other merchants selling similar items. This market intelligence gathering occurred through formal channels like market observations and informal channels like conversations with other merchants, porters, brokers, and locals involved in trade. The brokers and intermediaries in foreign markets provided essential services while extracting their shares of profit. Brokers connected foreign merchants with local buyers, facilitated communication across language barriers, advised on local customs and practices, arranged for goods assessment and authentication, and sometimes provided credit or guarantees. A trustworthy broker was invaluable. A dishonest one could destroy a merchant's venture through fraud or simply poor advice. The language barriers posed constant challenges. Even merchants who spoke several languages rarely mastered all those they encountered. Interpreters were essential, but had to be trusted with commercially sensitive information. Misunderstandings arising from poor translation could destroy deals. The specialized vocabulary of trade in different languages required precise communication about qualities, quantities, prices, and terms that was difficult when working through interpretation. The actual selling of goods involved multiple possible approaches. Wholesale to local merchants moved large quantities quickly, but often meant accepting lower prices. Retail sale directly to consumers required more time and local knowledge, but potentially brought higher returns. Consignment arrangements with local merchants provided access to their distribution networks and customer relationships. Each approach had advantages and risks that merchants balanced based on specific situations. The price negotiation followed local customs that varied dramatically across cultures. Some markets expected extensive haggling, with initial offers far from acceptable prices, while others considered such negotiation insulting and expected more direct dealing. The protocols around negotiation, the acceptable behaviours during bargaining, and the ways agreements were finalised all varied by region and culture. Merchants ignorant of local practices appeared foolish or gave offence, damaging their business prospects. The quality assessment and authentication of goods was perpetual concern on both sides of transactions. Buyers wanted assurance they were receiving genuine goods of claimed quality. Merchants wanted to avoid accusations of fraud that could destroy reputations. Various authentication methods existed depending on goods. Textile merchants knew how to test fabric quality. Spice merchants could identify adulterants. Gem merchants used various tests for authenticity. The expertise required for proper quality assessment was specialised knowledge that took years to develop. The payment methods involved diverse instruments and currencies. Cash transactions used local currencies that merchants had to understand and evaluate for purity and weight. Bills of exchange allowed merchants to access funds deposited in other cities, facilitating commerce without physically transporting large amounts of coin. Letters of credit provided payment guarantees. Barter or exchange of goods occurred when currency wasn't available or when it simplified transactions. Merchants needed financial literacy encompassing multiple currencies, exchange rates, credit instruments, and accounting practices. The record-keeping throughout trade activities was essential for successful merchants. Detailed accounts tracked purchases, sales, expenses, profits, debts owed and owing, and the myriad financial transactions comprising the merchant business. Some merchants were sophisticated bookkeepers using double-entry methods that allowed accurate tracking of complex business operations. Others kept simpler records that at least provided basic accountability. The paperwork generated by trade was substantial and required organisation and attention to detail. The social obligations that came with trade went beyond simple buying and selling. Merchants established relationships with local merchants, officials, and various facilitators their business depended upon. These relationships required cultivation through dinners, gifts, and social interaction that had business purposes but needed to appear as genuine hospitality and friendship. The mixing of business and social life was inevitable, and required social skills alongside commercial acumen. The religious and cultural practices of trade partners had to be navigated respectfully. Muslim merchants honoured Islamic business ethics and avoided forbidden transactions. Christian merchants adhered to church teachings on usury and just prices. Hindu merchants operated within their own religious frameworks. Jewish merchants maintained kosher practices and observed Sabbath. Successful foreign merchants showed respect for local religious sensibilities even when they didn't share those beliefs, avoiding offence that would harm business relationships. The contracts and agreements that formalised trades needed to be enforceable, which meant understanding local legal systems and customary law. Some trading communities had their own legal frameworks recognised by local authorities. Muslim merchants might use Islamic commercial law. Italian merchants brought their own legal traditions. The enforcement mechanisms range from formal courts to merchant tribunals to community pressure and reputation systems. Merchants needed to structure agreements in ways that would be enforceable in the relevant jurisdiction. The duration of stay in trading centres varied enormously. Some merchants spent weeks or months at a destination, waiting for opportunities, cultivating relationships, and conducting multiple transactions. Others concluded business quickly and moved on to the next destination or began the return journey. The longer stays allowed for more thorough exploitation of market opportunities, but also meant increased expenses, greater disease risk, and extended time away from home. The purchase of return cargo was as important as selling outgoing goods. The ideal complete trade saw merchants selling goods brought from home, and purchasing different goods to transport back, profiting from price differentials in both directions, identifying what goods would sell profitably in the home market while avoiding the mistakes of over-purchasing or buying poor quality items required the same commercial judgment as the original venture, but in reverse. The departure preparations began the cycle again. Merchants settled debts, collected payments owed, arranged transport for return goods, and prepared for the journey home. The emotional valence was different than departure from home, with merchants now anticipating returning to families and familiar environments, rather than venturing into the unknown. Yet the journey home was as dangerous as the outbound trip, with no guarantee of arriving safely despite successfully completing business. The conducting of business in foreign lands revealed the merchant's role as cultural intermediary and cosmopolitan figure. Successful merchants developed ability to function in multiple cultural contexts, understanding and respecting different practices while maintaining their own identities and interests. This cultural fluidity, while essential for business success, also contributed to social suspicion of merchants as people whose loyalties and identities seemed ambiguous, and whose ease in foreign contexts suggested lack of proper attachment to home communities. Merchants didn't operate as isolated individuals, but within complex social networks that provided information, trust, capital, and the various forms of support necessary for commercial success. Understanding these social structures reveals that merchant success depended as much on relationship management and community integration as on individual skill and courage. The social world merchants inhabited was simultaneously global and intimate, connecting far-flung territories while depending on personal bonds and face-to-face interactions. The merchant communities in major trading centres formed the foundation of these social networks. Cities like Venice, Cairo, Baghdad, Samarkand, Calicut, and Quanzhou had substantial merchant populations including both locals and foreigners. Within these populations, merchants organised along various lines including ethnicity, religion, home region, and kinship. These communities provided mutual support, information exchange, and social structure for individuals who were otherwise strangers in foreign lands. The ethnic and religious communities were particularly important. Muslim merchants throughout the Indian Ocean region formed networks connecting East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. Genoese and Venetian merchant communities established themselves in ports throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Armenian merchants created trade networks connecting the Middle East, Central Asia, and eventually Europe. Jewish merchants formed the Radhanites and other networks spanning from Spain to China. Chinese merchant communities appeared in Southeast Asian ports. These communities preserved cultural identities while facilitating trade across vast distances. The residential patterns in trading cities often reflected these community divisions. Foreign merchants congregated in particular quarters, sometimes by choice and sometimes due to legal requirements. These ethnic neighbourhoods provided familiar cultural environments, religious institutions, language communities, and mutual aid networks. A Muslim merchant arriving in Quanzhou could find the Muslim quarter and immediately access community resources. A Venetian merchant in Constantinople headed for the Venetian quarter, where fellow merchants provided welcome and support. The guilds and professional organisations provided more formal structures. Merchant guilds regulated trade practices, maintained professional standards, adjudicated disputes among members, and negotiated collectively with political authorities. Guild membership provided legitimacy, access to commercial opportunities, and the guild's support in disputes with outsiders. The guilds also served social functions, organising festivals, supporting members during hardship, and providing burial and memorial services for deceased merchants. The family networks were fundamental to merchant social structures. Merchant businesses were often family enterprises, with brothers, fathers and sons, uncles and nephews, and extended family members forming partnerships and conducting coordinated operations. Family ties provided the trust that was essential when partners operated at great distances with minimal oversight. A merchant in Venice might send goods with his brother travelling to Alexandria, trusting family loyalty to ensure honest dealing. The marriage alliances between merchant families created social and business networks spanning regions. Merchant families arranged marriages to form bonds with other commercial families, creating relationships that facilitated business cooperation and provided access to partners' commercial networks. The strategic dimension of merchant marriage meant that personal compatibility might be secondary to business considerations, with unions serving to cement partnerships, open new markets, or unite competing interests. The multi-generational nature of merchant families meant that commercial knowledge, relationships and reputation passed through generations. Children of merchants grew up in the trade, learning languages, customs, routes, market conditions and business practices from early ages. This apprenticeship within family firms created continuity and accumulated knowledge across generations. The most successful merchant families maintained prominence across centuries, with each generation building on predecessors' accomplishments. The gender dimensions of merchant social worlds were complex and varied by culture. Men dominated long-distance trade, conducting most travelling and being most visible in merchant activities. Yet women played crucial roles that sources often underreport. Merchant wives managed businesses during husbands' absences, conducted trade on their own account, oversaw household finances, and maintained social connections essential to family business. Some women became merchants themselves, though this was unusual and often met with social disapproval. The widow's position was particularly important in merchant communities. Women who inherited their husbands' businesses sometimes continued operating them, either directly or through trusted agents. Widows of successful merchants might be wealthy individuals commanding respect and wielding influence in merchant communities. The property rights and legal status of widows varied by jurisdiction, with some legal systems allowing widows considerable economic agency, while others restricted their activities. The apprenticeship and training systems integrated newcomers into merchant communities. Young men might be placed with established merchants to learn the trade, serving as assistants while developing necessary skills. These apprenticeships often involved distant relatives or family friends, utilising kinship and social networks to place young men in training positions. The successful apprentice might eventually be taken on as junior partner, creating pathway for social mobility and business expansion. The information networks connecting merchants were essential infrastructure for commercial success. Letters circulated between merchants in different locations, sharing market intelligence, reporting political developments, describing trade opportunities, and maintaining social relationships. The circulation of information through merchant networks meant that commercial intelligence often travelled faster than official communications, with merchants knowing about distant events before governments did. The reputation systems within merchant networks functioned as enforcement mechanisms in the absence of strong legal frameworks. A merchant who defrauded partners or engaged in dishonest dealing would find his reputation destroyed, making future business impossible as word spread through networks. The gossip and information sharing that occurred in merchant gathering places served both social and economic functions, creating accountability through community knowledge and judgment. The trust that these networks generated was essential for facilitating trade across vast distances. Long-distance commerce required extending credit, trusting partners to act honestly when direct oversight was impossible, and relying on others to uphold agreements when legal enforcement was uncertain. The social networks provided the trust relationships that made these arrangements workable, with reputation, kinship, religious identity and community membership, creating bonds strong enough to support commercial cooperation. The conflicts within and between merchant communities created social dramas and sometimes violence. Commercial disputes, competition for opportunities, personal enmities, and clashes over status and respect all generated tensions. Some merchant communities had internal mechanisms for dispute resolution, including arbitration, community pressure, and formal tribunals. When internal resolution failed, conflicts might escalate to involve political authorities or even result in violence. The relationship between merchants and political authorities was complex and often fraught. Merchants needed political stability, property protection, and reasonable taxation, making them natural supporters of stable government. Yet merchants also chafed at regulations, taxes, and official interference in commerce. Politically powerful merchants could sometimes influence government policy, securing favourable treatment for their communities. Powerless merchants suffered from arbitrary authority and exploitation. The diplomatic roles that merchants sometimes filled reflected their unique position. Travelling between states, speaking multiple languages, and possessing knowledge of distant lands made merchants valuable as informal diplomats and intelligence sources. Rulers sometimes employed merchants as envoys, taking advantage of their cross-cultural competence and commercial contacts. Merchants also served as intelligence gatherers, reporting on conditions in foreign territories they visited. The philanthropic activities of successful merchants enhanced their reputations and provided community benefits. Wealthy merchants endowed religious institutions, funded charitable activities, built public works like caravanserais and bridges, and provided various community services. This philanthropy served multiple purposes: fulfilling religious obligations, enhancing social status, securing divine favour, and creating public goods that also facilitated trade. The merchant as public benefactor was a recognised social role in many cultures. The children raised in merchant families experienced unique childhoods shaped by their fathers' absences, the cosmopolitan environments of trading centres, and the commercial education they received. These children might be multilingual from early ages, familiar with diverse cultural practices, and trained in commercial arithmetic and business practices. They also endured long separations from travelling fathers, with some growing up barely knowing their fathers who spent most of their time on trade routes. The elderly merchants who survived their travelling years accumulated positions as respected elders in merchant communities. Their experience, knowledge, and networks made them valuable advisors to younger merchants. Retired merchants might continue participating in trade by providing capital for younger relatives' ventures, while no longer facing travel's dangers themselves. The successful merchants' later years could be comfortable, surrounded by family and respected within the community they helped build. Understanding the social world of merchants reveals that commercial success required not just individual capability, but effective integration into communities and networks. The isolated entrepreneur of popular imagination rarely succeeded in long-distance trade. The merchant who cultivated relationships, maintained reputation, leveraged family and ethnic networks, and participated actively in merchant communities had far better prospects than even more talented individuals who operated alone. The social capital was as essential as financial capital for sustaining long-term merchant success. Beyond their economic functions, travelling merchants served as crucial cultural intermediaries who carried information, technologies, religious ideas, artistic styles, and various cultural elements between societies. Understanding this cultural role reveals that merchants were far more than mobile merchants of goods. They were agents of cultural transmission and catalysts for the cosmopolitan exchanges that shaped medieval Eurasian history. The impact of merchants on culture was profound and lasting, though often unintended and rarely fully acknowledged by either merchants themselves or the societies they connected. The information transmission that occurred through merchant networks was perhaps their most immediate cultural impact. Merchants travelling between regions carried news of political events, military campaigns, natural disasters, and other significant occurrences. In eras before formal journalism or rapid long-distance communication, merchant intelligence often provided the earliest reports of distant events. Rulers, administrators, and ordinary people relied on merchants for information about the wider world beyond their immediate territories. The reliability of merchant information varied considerably. Merchants had incentive to provide accurate intelligence, as their own business success depended on understanding conditions correctly. Yet they also sometimes spread rumours, misunderstood what they observed, or deliberately distorted information for various purposes. Recipients of merchant reports had to evaluate credibility, corroborate from multiple sources, and recognise that merchants' perspectives were shaped by their own interests and limited understanding. The geographic knowledge that merchants accumulated and transmitted was fundamental to pre-modern understanding of world geography. Merchants knew routes, distances, locations of cities and resources, and the practical details of travelling through regions. This knowledge was sometimes recorded in merchant handbooks, rutters, and geographic descriptions that became resources for subsequent travellers. The famous medieval travel accounts like those of Marco Polo were essentially merchants' reports, providing European audiences with information about distant lands that would otherwise have been completely unknown. The linguistic exchanges facilitated by merchants contributed to language development and multilingualism. Merchants learned languages out of practical necessity, acquiring enough facility to conduct business in multiple tongues. This multilingualism created linguistic bridges between societies and contributed to the development of trade pidgins and creoles that facilitated cross-cultural communication. The vocabulary of commerce itself spread through merchant networks, with terms for goods, measures, and commercial practices being adopted across linguistic boundaries. The religious transmission through merchant networks was substantial and historically significant. Muslim merchants carried Islam to Southeast Asia, East Africa, and various parts of Central Asia, establishing Muslim communities that persist today. Christian merchants spread their faith to some regions, though less extensively than Muslim traders. Buddhist merchants historically contributed to Buddhism's spread along the Silk Road. Jewish merchants maintained Jewish communities throughout the medieval world. While merchants weren't primarily missionaries, their religious practices and community building contributed to religious expansion. The material culture that merchants transported included not just trade goods, but also the artistic styles, technical knowledge, and aesthetic sensibilities embodied in those goods. Chinese porcelain, Islamic metalwork, Indian textiles, and European manufactured goods carried with them the artistic traditions of their origins. Local artisans exposed to foreign goods sometimes adapted techniques and styles, creating hybrid forms that combined local and foreign elements. The visual culture of medieval Eurasia was profoundly shaped by the circulation of goods and the artistic influences they carried. The technological diffusion often occurred through merchant networks. Technologies embodied in trade goods could be studied and potentially reverse-engineered by local craftspeople. Merchants also carried knowledge about techniques, whether intentionally as trade secrets to establish production in new locations, or inadvertently through describing what they had seen. The spread of paper-making, silk production, various metallurgical techniques, and countless other technologies occurred partly through merchant transmission. The culinary exchanges resulting from spice trade and food distribution introduced distant populations to new flavours and ingredients. The spices that merchants transported from Southeast Asia to Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East transformed cuisines and created tastes that persisted for centuries. The circulation of new crops, cooking techniques, and food preparation methods occurred through merchant networks connecting agricultural systems and culinary traditions across vast distances. The medical knowledge that circulated through merchant networks included information about drugs, treatments, and medical theories. Merchants traded medicinal substances like opium, mercury compounds, various herbs, and other therapeutic materials. Along with the substances came knowledge about their uses, contributing to medical exchanges between traditions. Muslim physicians' works circulated to Europe partly through merchant connections. Chinese medical knowledge reached westward. The medical pluralism that characterized many medieval societies owed much to merchant-facilitated exchanges. The fashion and textile influences that spread through cloth trade affected dress and material culture across regions. The prestige of imported textiles made them aspirational goods that local elites sought to emulate. Indian cottons, Chinese silks, and European woolens each had their markets and influenced local production, as artisans attempted to recreate foreign styles or developed hybrid textiles combining local and foreign characteristics. The visual culture of dress was transformed by the circulation of textiles through merchant networks. The architectural influences sometimes resulted from merchant presence in foreign cities. The buildings merchants constructed for their own use, including trading facilities, religious structures, and residences, brought architectural styles and techniques to new locations. The fondaggi in Mediterranean cities, caravanserais across the Islamic world, and various commercial structures reflected architectural traditions from merchants' home regions while adapting to local conditions, creating hybrid forms. The musical and entertainment traditions that merchants encountered in their travels sometimes made their way back home through merchants' descriptions or through the transport of instruments and performers. The cosmopolitan ports and trading centres where merchants gathered became sites of cultural mixing, where musical traditions encountered each other. While merchants weren't primarily cultural performers, their role in facilitating movement between cultures contributed to musical exchanges and developments. The philosophical and intellectual exchanges occurred through books and ideas that travelled merchant routes. The recovery of classical texts in medieval Europe depended partly on merchant contacts with the Islamic world, where many texts had been preserved. The circulation of mathematical, astronomical, and philosophical works between Islamic, Indian, Chinese, and European intellectual traditions occurred through various channels, including merchant networks. The social practices and customs that merchants observed and sometimes adopted contributed to cross-cultural borrowing. Merchants who spent extended time in foreign locations absorbed local customs, sometimes bringing practices back to their home communities. The dining customs, business practices, social protocols, and various everyday behaviours that merchants learned abroad sometimes influenced practices in their home societies, particularly when successful merchants became trendsetters whose behaviour others emulated. The marriage and kinship patterns that developed through merchant networks created biological as well as cultural exchanges. Merchants who married locally in foreign trading centres produced children who embodied cultural mixing, growing up with multiple identities and serving as bridges between communities. The children of mixed merchant marriages sometimes became merchants themselves, inheriting access to multiple cultural and commercial networks. The educational transmission that occurred as merchants shared practical knowledge contributed to the spread of commercial literacy, mathematical skills, and practical geography. The merchant manuals that circulated teaching business practices disseminated this knowledge more broadly. The informal education that occurred through apprenticeships trained young people in commercial skills, while also exposing them to cosmopolitan perspectives and cross-cultural competencies. The environmental exchanges, while sometimes inadvertent and unwelcome, also occurred through merchant networks. Diseases travelled merchant routes, with devastating results when introduced to populations lacking immunity. The Black Death spread along trade routes in the 14th century. Other epidemic diseases followed similar patterns. Rats, insects, and various pests travelled in cargo, establishing themselves in new territories. Plant and animal species were sometimes intentionally introduced through merchant activity, transforming local ecologies. The identity formations that resulted from merchant cosmopolitanism created distinctive social types. The merchant who had travelled extensively, spoke multiple languages, knew diverse customs, and maintained ties to multiple communities developed identity that transcended simple ethnic or regional categories. This cosmopolitan merchant identity was both celebrated and suspected, admired for sophistication, while criticised for lack of proper loyalty to any single community or tradition. The lasting cultural legacies of merchant networks include the hybrid cultures that developed in major trading centres. Cities like Venice, Istanbul, Alexandria, Malacca, and others became profoundly cosmopolitan through their roles as commercial hubs. The cultural mixing that occurred in these centres created unique local cultures that blended diverse influences. These cosmopolitan trading cities became cultural powerhouses whose influence extended far beyond their economic functions. Understanding merchants as cultural intermediaries reveals that their impact went far beyond delivering goods from one place to another. They were agents of historical change, catalysing cultural exchanges and transformations that reshaped societies. The cosmopolitan competencies they developed, the information and knowledge they transmitted, and the connections they maintained between distant societies made merchants central figures in medieval globalization. The cultural world of medieval Eurasia, with its extraordinary creativity and cross-fertilization of ideas, arts, and practices, owed much to the merchants who moved between cultures carrying not just goods, but the cultural freight that accompanied commerce. The category merchant encompassed enormous diversity, from itinerant peddlers carrying modest goods on their backs to wealthy merchant princes commanding fleets and financing kings. Understanding this hierarchy reveals the social stratification within commercial classes and shows that merchant experiences varied as dramatically by wealth and status as did experiences in any other social category. The peddler's life bore little resemblance to the merchant prince's existence despite both being engaged in trade. The humble peddler or petty trader represented the bottom of the commercial hierarchy. These individuals travelled between villages and small towns, carrying baskets or packs containing small quantities of goods for direct sale to consumers. The peddler's capital investment was minimal, often just the goods themselves and basic travel equipment. The profit margins were thin, with peddlers earning survival income rather than accumulating wealth. This was commercial activity at its most basic level. The peddler's life was hard and insecure. Walking long distances daily while carrying heavy loads caused physical exhaustion and injury. The petty trader had no protection from bandits beyond whatever weapons he could carry, and whatever safety came from appearing to have little worth stealing. Sleeping rough, or in the cheapest accommodation, eating minimally, and enduring all weather without adequate protection created grinding hardship. The petty trader was often barely distinguishable from beggars in social status. The goods peddlers carried were correspondingly humble: needles and thread, simple ribbons and small decorative items, basic tools, cheap pottery, whatever small manufactured items rural populations might purchase. The peddler's role was bringing manufactured goods to areas that lacked regular access to markets, serving populations too dispersed or too poor to support permanent shops. The service was valuable to rural communities despite the peddler's low status. The social reception peddlers received was mixed. They were welcomed for the goods they brought, but also viewed with suspicion as strangers and potential thieves or troublemakers. Peddlers had poor reputations for honesty, with tales of fraudulent goods and deceptive practices being common. Whether this reputation was earned or merely prejudice against low-status travellers, it affected how peddlers were treated in the communities they visited. The regional merchant trading within a relatively limited geographic area represented a step up in scale and status from the peddler. These merchants might operate from a base in a town, travelling to nearby villages and other towns to purchase goods for resale, or to deliver goods on commission. The capital investment was larger than the peddlers but still modest. The distances shorter than long-distance traders covered, and the risks less severe though still significant. The regional merchant might own or rent shop space in a town, providing a base for business operations. Stock could be stored there, accounts maintained, and business conducted with both local customers and travelling agents. The regional merchant's social status was respectable if modest, recognised as a legitimate businessman rather than a marginal transient. Family life was possible, with the merchant returning home regularly rather than being absent for months or years. The goods regional merchants handled included basic necessities and modest luxuries, grain and other foodstuffs, simple textiles, basic manufactured items, and whatever goods their regions produced for export. The trade was essential to regional economic function, distributing agricultural surpluses and manufactured goods, while creating market connections between urban and rural areas. Though unglamorous, this regional trade was the foundation of pre-modern economies. The wholesale merchant trading in larger quantities and sometimes longer distances occupied the middle range of the merchant hierarchy. These merchants had substantial capital, dealt in significant volumes, and often specialised in particular types of goods. They might travel occasionally, but increasingly relied on agents and partners to conduct distant operations while they managed business from a central location. This was professional commerce of more sophisticated variety. The wholesale merchants' investments were substantial, often requiring partnerships or loans to finance operations. The goods traded were typically more valuable per unit. Fine textiles rather than coarse cloth, quality metalwork rather than basic tools, spices and other valuable commodities rather than bulk foodstuffs. The profit margins were higher than regional trade allowed, but the risks were correspondingly greater, with larger amounts of capital at stake. The social status of successful wholesale merchants was considerable. They were respected businessmen, perhaps guild members, and sometimes held civic office in their home cities. Their wealth allowed comfortable lifestyles, substantial homes and social connections that regional merchants couldn't achieve. The wholesale merchants' children might receive good educations and make respectable marriages, though nobility remained beyond reach for most merchant families. The international long-distance merchants specialising in luxury trades represented the elite of the commercial classes. These merchants dealt in the most valuable goods: silks, the finest spices, precious stones, high-quality manufactures. The capital requirements were enormous, often involving partnerships with multiple investors. The journeys crossed cultural and political boundaries, requiring sophisticated cross-cultural competence and extensive networks. The international merchant rarely travelled personally once established, instead operating through agents, partners, and family members stationed in various trading centres. The successful international merchant became business executive managing far-flung operations from a central office, receiving reports, making strategic decisions, and coordinating activities across vast distances. This was sophisticated commercial enterprise requiring literacy, numeracy, and administrative capability. The wealth that successful international merchants accumulated could be substantial, rivaling or exceeding that of nobility. The most successful merchants owned multiple properties, financed political activities, lent money to rulers, and wielded influence well beyond their formal legal status. This wealth created ambiguous social positions, with nouveau riche merchants possessing economic power without corresponding social status. The merchant bankers represented the ultimate development of commercial success into financial power. These individuals or families combined trade with banking, providing credit, facilitating payments, and managing finances for others, including rulers and governments. The Medici, Fuggers, and other famous merchant banking families became financial powers whose importance transcended commerce to shape political and cultural history. The merchant bankers' activities extended beyond trade to include various financial services, money changing, loans, bills of exchange, and increasingly sophisticated instruments. The merchant bank maintained correspondence in major trading centres, creating networks that could transfer funds, provide credit, and conduct business across vast distances. This financial infrastructure was essential to medieval and early modern commerce and state finance. The political influence that merchant bankers could wield came from their financial importance to rulers constantly needing money for wars, administration, and displays of power. Rulers who depended on merchant bankers for loans had to maintain good relations with them, giving commercial interests political voice despite merchants' formerly subordinate status. Some merchant bankers became indispensable to monarchs, effectively partnering with royal power. The merchant prince was the culmination of commercial success, a merchant whose wealth, power, and status elevated him to positions rivaling nobility. In some contexts, notably Italian city-states like Venice and Florence, successful merchants could achieve actual political power, becoming rulers or at least members of governing oligarchies. The merchant prince combined vast wealth with political power and cultural patronage, becoming a major historical figure. The social mobility that commerce offered was one of trade's attractions. The peddler's son might become a regional merchant. The regional merchant's grandson might achieve international trade success. The international merchant's descendants might become merchant bankers or princes. This mobility path existed alongside high failure rates, with many merchants falling back down the hierarchy through misfortune or poor judgment. The possibility of rising motivated risk-taking and ambition. The guild structures in many medieval cities reflected and reinforced merchant hierarchies. Different guilds represented different levels and types of commerce, with membership in prestigious merchant guilds being mark of status and access to commercial opportunities. The guild hierarchies had parallels in actual wealth and status hierarchies, though the correspondence was imperfect and varied across cities and regions. The distinctions between these merchant levels weren't always sharp or permanent. Regional merchants sometimes engaged in long-distance trade. International merchants might deal in wholesale regional goods when opportunities arose. Merchant bankers still sometimes engaged in actual trade. The fluidity meant that commercial fortunes could rise or fall relatively quickly, compared to the more stable hereditary aristocratic hierarchies. The different cultural impacts of various merchant types deserve recognition. The humble peddler connected remote villages to market economies and spread information and small manufactured goods. The regional merchant created commercial networks within areas. The international merchant facilitated luxury trades and cultural exchanges between distant regions. The merchant banker financed states and great enterprises. Each level contributed differently to economic and cultural development. Understanding the diversity within merchant ranks corrects simplistic images of the merchant as a single type. The merchant category included everything from desperate men barely surviving as petty traders to fabulously wealthy individuals directing commercial empires. The experiences, social status, and historical impact varied accordingly, yet all shared the fundamental characteristic of making their livings through moving goods between locations where values differed, taking risks in pursuit of profit, and navigating between cultures and communities while belonging fully to none. As the caravan finally arrives at its destination, as the ship makes port after months at sea, as the merchant begins the accounting that will determine whether the venture succeeded or failed, reflection on the merchant's life reveals a complex reality defying simple characterization. The travelling merchant's existence combined adventure with anxiety, cosmopolitanism with alienation, potential wealth with likely ruin, freedom from routine with bondage to commerce's demands. The economic contribution that merchants made to pre-modern societies cannot be overstated. They were essential connective tissue binding, together the specialised regional economies that characterised the medieval world. Without merchants, the silk produced in China would never have reached Europe, the spices of Indonesia would have remained unknown beyond their islands, the gold of West Africa would have stayed in Africa. The geographic specialisation that allowed regions to develop their productive advantages depended absolutely on merchants willing to transport goods across the distances separating production from consumption. The profit motives that drove merchants were often condemned by religious and philosophical traditions, emphasising otherworldly values or social hierarchy over individual enrichment. Yet the actual services merchants provided, however motivated, benefited societies materially. The merchant brought goods people wanted or needed. He distributed surpluses and reduced scarcities. He created market connections that allowed producers to specialise and consumers to access variety. The moral suspicion of commerce coexisted uneasily with the practical benefits it delivered. The risks merchants faced were genuine and substantial, justifying the profit margins that moralists sometimes criticised as usurious. A merchant might invest everything, endure months of dangerous travel, and still arrive to find the market changed, goods unsaleable, or opportunities vanished. The high returns successful trades generated compensated for the failures that destroyed other ventures. The risk-reward calculation was economically rational even when it appeared exploitative to those unfamiliar with commerce's uncertainties. The courage that merchant life required deserves acknowledgement. Setting out on long journeys, knowing the dangers, continuing forward despite losses and setbacks, maintaining composure in foreign environments where one was powerless and vulnerable, all these required genuine bravery. The merchant wasn't a warrior fighting gloriously in battle, but neither was he a safe civilian avoiding danger. He faced death regularly and continued choosing to travel despite knowing the statistics and stories of those who didn't return. The cosmopolitan competence that successful merchants developed was remarkable and historically important. Learning multiple languages, understanding diverse customs, navigating between cultures, and maintaining complex networks across vast distances required intelligence and adaptability. The merchant's cosmopolitanism contributed to the cultural exchanges and borrowings that enriched medieval civilizations. The merchant's mobility between cultures made him both valued intermediary and suspected outsider. The ambiguous social status of merchants reflected society's contradictory attitudes toward commerce. Merchants were needed but not respected, wealthy but not honourable, useful but not trustworthy. This ambiguity shaped merchant identity and behaviour. Some merchants internalised social subordination, accepting lower status despite wealth. Others chafed at aristocratic pretensions, eventually claiming status commensurate with their economic importance. The tension between economic power and social status was never fully resolved in pre-modern societies. The family sacrifices that merchant life entailed deserve recognition. The travelling merchant left wives and children for months or years, missing births, children's development, and family crises. The merchant wife managed alone, essentially becoming single parent and household manager during extended absences. When merchants died abroad, families often never learned their fate, left with ambiguous loss and uncertain economic circumstances. The merchant's wealth, when achieved, compensated families materially, but couldn't fully replace absence. The psychological toll of merchant life, while difficult to measure or document, was surely substantial. The constant anxiety about venture success or failure, the stress of dangerous travel, the loneliness of being away from home and community, the culture shock of navigating foreign societies, the guilt about family neglect, all these contributed to psychological burden. Some merchants doubtless thrived on adventure and challenge, but others endured merchant life because no better alternatives existed. The ageing merchant who survived career's dangers and achieved modest success faced the question of whether to continue risking journeys or to retire while ahead. Some merchants did retire, using accumulated capital to invest in urban properties, lend at interest, or provide capital for younger merchants' ventures while no longer travelling personally. Others continued travelling until health or catastrophic failure ended careers. The gambler's dilemma of knowing when to quit affected merchant careers as much as any gambling activity. The legacies merchants left were both material and cultural. The wealth some accumulated financed the next generation's opportunities, and sometimes endowed charitable or cultural institutions. The cultural exchanges merchants facilitated shaped civilization's artistic, intellectual and material development. The commercial practices and institutions merchants developed laid foundations for modern economic systems. The impact extended far beyond individual lives and profits. The modern resonances of merchant experiences deserve brief note. The travelling salesperson enduring uncomfortable travel to meet clients, the international businessperson navigating between cultures, the entrepreneur risking capital on uncertain ventures, all have predecessors in medieval merchants. The specific technologies and contexts differ dramatically, but some fundamental experiences of commerce transcend eras. The anxiety of risk-taking, the challenges of cross-cultural communication, the excitement of closing deals, the disappointment of failures. The ethical questions merchants faced remain relevant. How much profit is justified? What obligations exist to trading partners, to home communities, to foreign hosts? When does self-interest become exploitation? How should one balance family obligations against business demands? Medieval merchants grappled with these questions within their religious and philosophical frameworks, reaching various answers. The questions persist, taking different forms but retaining their essential challenge. The diversity within merchant ranks, from desperate peddlers to merchant princes, reflected and contributed to social complexity. Commerce created social mobility paths, allowing some people to transcend their birth status. Yet it also created new forms of inequality and exploitation, with successful merchants sometimes becoming as oppressive as the aristocrats whose power they resented. The merchant class wasn't inherently progressive or democratizing, but rather a social category as internally diverse and morally mixed as any other. The historical importance of merchants has sometimes been underestimated in narratives focused on political and military history. Yet economic historians increasingly recognize that the merchants who connected regional economies, facilitated cultural exchanges, and developed commercial institutions were agents of historical change as significant as the rulers and generals who traditionally dominate narratives. The slow transformations merchants catalyzed through their daily business activities shaped history as profoundly as the dramatic events of battles and dynastic struggles. In the end, the merchant's life was one of calculated risk-taking, cultural navigation, commercial calculation, physical endurance, and psychological resilience. It was life chosen by those who saw opportunities for profit and advancement despite dangers and hardships. It was life shaped by geographic and social structures, but also by individual decisions, abilities, and fortune. It was simultaneously marginal and central, despised and essential, dangerous and potentially rewarding. The travelling merchant, with his worn boots and ledgers, his knowledge of distant places and ability to speak their languages, his anxiety about distant goods and hope for profitable return, embodied particular human responses to the opportunities and constraints of pre-modern economic life. Understanding his world reveals not just economic history, but human history in its material, social, cultural, and psychological dimensions. The merchant moved goods, but in doing so he moved history itself, connecting civilizations and facilitating exchanges that shaped the world we inherited. His journeys, motivated by profit, created connections and consequences that far transcended individual gain, making the travelling merchant an essential, if often overlooked, historical actor whose impact continues resonating across centuries.